right here. Hey, thank you everyone for joining us on this rainy night in Toronto. I really appreciate you all being here. Hope you had some pizza, some drinks. Thank you very much for joining us. Start with a quick land acknowledgement. We acknowledge that the land we're meeting on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. It is now home to many good First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit. Can you hear me back there? Yeah. Great. Nice. A dying down of conversation. I love that. Thank you. First off, we wouldn't be anywhere today if it wasn't for this amazing venue. So please give it up for Resolver for hosting us. Second month in a row, they're a pro-business. They do risk intelligence, safeguarding, over 6.5 trillion in market cap for more than 1,000 global companies. So there's quite a few Resolver teammates around the building. Say hello, introduce yourselves. They're all wonderful people. We have an event sponsor in product faculty. It's an advanced product management course designed for product managers and leaders. It's a 5-week hands-on training created specifically for senior product managers. So if you're interested in that, we're going to be posting more information about that on our Slack. We also have 2 other sponsors who we always like to shout out, Martin Bassett Associates and Leicester. They have been with us for the entire year. Heidi from Martin Bassett is over there. Say hi. So introduce yourself later. They've been amazing supporters of the TPMA. Our volunteers. The TPMA is a completely volunteer-run organization, and it wouldn't happen, and nothing would happen without our volunteers. So a big round of applause for all of our volunteers. We have a series of workshops that we're going to be launching over the next couple of months. These are smaller format events. Well, the online events are unlimited size, but there are some smaller format events that are going to be happening in July and August. The Building a Product Strategy with Angela Formina on June 11th. Resume evaluation with Heidi. If you ever have the chance to get a resume evaluation by Heidi, it is a humbling and wonderful experience. Yes, it is a very good learning opportunity. So I highly recommend everyone come to that. And then we'll have more about product discovery and managing your stakeholders after that. Let's get on to it. Tonight's event, How Cloud Native Computing is Changing Product Management in 2024. We have 2 wonderful speakers, Mark Farmer, Senior Director of Product at Applied Digital, also a former TPMA president.
Yes.
So coming back to his old roots, so thank you very much. He's going to tell you a little bit about the work he does in his presentation, but we also have Jungho Kim, a Principal Cloud Solution Architect at Microsoft. Microsoft's not had a busy year at all, have you? So really excited to teach us a lot about the work that you do at Microsoft and cloud computing. Yeah, really happy to have you here, so thank you so much. As per usual, we are accepting questions from the audience. We'll be doing a Q&A portion at the end of the event. If you have a camera, quickly snap a photo of that QR code. Submit your questions as the event goes on. We'll put that QR code back on at the Q&A portion. And we'll dive into it. So, I'm going to hand it off to Mark.
Well, thanks. Good to see everybody. And actually, would like to give a shout out to Heidi and her resume review skills. Before I joined Applied Digital, Heidi took the time to review mine, and she gave me such incredible feedback. And my, ego after leaving my last company was maybe like a little bruised, and she kind of was like, "But this is amazing! You have to tell people." And she was just so encouraging. And I didn't even get a chance actually to even update all of the things that she said in the resume because I already got a new job. But I definitely credit Heidi to her insight of many years helping product people specifically. So glad I got a chance to thank you personally, Heidi. So definitely meet Heidi tonight. That should be one of your goals. Just out of curiosity, folks in the room, I kind of feel like a couple of years ago, we used to talk about Agile all the time at TPMA, and every year I was like, oh, surely this is the last year we have to talk about Agile, like everyone's just gonna be doing it. But I'm curious, folks in the room, like how many of you are, for example, at a SaaS company of some kind? Okay, so a big chunk. Okay, so hopefully we're not like totally preaching to the converted, and we'll kind of give you some insight. But really happy to kind of be here today, and also with Jungho, who I've known for quite a number of years. We've worked together, and he's done a lot of great transformation work. So what I'm going to try and do is just sort of cover off a little bit of a perspective of some of the things that I've done. Most recently I was at Walmart for about 8 years. Went through a huge cloud-based, initially data transformation, but then we started building out like machine learning and AI modeling and bringing a lot of that stuff in-house. So really got a chance to see like what does transformation look like at a really, really massive scale, and got to play with a lot of like really cool toys, which was a lot of fun. So I'll talk a little bit about some of that, and then also a little bit about maybe if it resonates with you, probably a lot of the SaaS folks here will be like, yes, that's just the way we operate, and that's a good thing. But it's surprising the work that I do now, where the applied digital, I'm kind of, I actually have slides for this, but I'm kind of doing it anyways. Yeah, so that's me. But basically, it's amazing, similar in some ways to like Agile. I'm still working with companies that don't do Agile, and they sort of say they do, and so I feel like cloud will still be a topic for a long time to come. But I think the kind of key thing that we kind of do is we really help companies that are trying to transform, and are going to try and like give some things and hope that they resonate. As SaaS companies, for those of you that are part of them, you'd be like, yeah, that's totally a big part of our value proposition. But what I'm going to try and do, I hope, is like a little bit talk about what I've seen in terms of like actual, real, tangible business benefit, because I'm not sure in all cases when we talk about things like cloud, maybe some people dismiss it, oh, it's a technical thing, or it's a stack thing, or whatever. Yeah, it's all those things, but it's transformational in terms of what you can do with it, and Jungho is going to go into a little bit more in terms of some of the detail behind it. But I think for just as a kind of a thought starter in terms of like motivations for transformation, I hope some of these things kind of like resonate with you, and especially if you're not part of a SaaS company and you're part of maybe an enterprise. These are some of the things that early, 7, 8 years ago even, were very common kinds of things that, we would experience, like high costs, when I was at Walmart or a retailer. Black Friday is a pretty big thing. And so we would have to try and guess what's the volume and then have enough servers in our server farm to handle that. Guess what, we didn't have enough, and I'll get to that in a second. But it's just very, very expensive because you're buying capacity essentially, maybe, depending on your business and what you're supporting, for that one-time event in the year or whatever the case may be. So just very, very, very expensive. So the other thing too is we started in kind of a very, I would say, challenging thing with a lot of like monolithic applications. They were very tightly coupled. I might have a feature that I wanted to bring out on a particular date. If 4 other features were behind, the whole release got delayed, and my feature didn't get out until all those other things were fixed and solved for. So that was definitely kind of a thing that was like frustration for a long time. Scalability, I kind of touched on it. The ability to, on peaks, just like handle it. That was a big problem. Equally, I would say reliability. We had like these very like monolithic types of applications. If one piece fell over, the whole thing could fall over. So not exactly very resilient. And your ability to like restore things, it was like literally like Control-Alt-Delete on your entire website. Also a challenge. I think also as we were trying to deal with like change and improving things and gradually refactor things, being on this like monolithic style of application, it's kind of like if you wanted to like introduce something new and it was a new language as an example, well, you have to redo everything in that language because like you just couldn't, like you didn't have the right structures to like separate things and have APIs and some of the other things that we'll talk about in a second. And then just like the lack of flexibility to be able to do things, pivot quickly, make changes, and essentially just go at a really fast pace. And like I said, even the very smallest things, it really took a lot of time and was very expensive. And you know, if you're in a hyper-competitive business environment, that's a real challenge. So I think if any of these things kind of resonate with you, I'm sure for the SaaS companies are like, yeah, that's why we build it this way. But for others, hopefully, kind of, you know, some of those things resonate. So one of the things that since joining Apply is there's an industry consortium called the Mac Alliance. When I started hearing about it, I frankly only heard about it when I started the interview process with this company. I was like, I totally did that. I did a mock transformation. I just didn't know that that's what it was called. Because like when you go through it, you just like, it just makes common sense. Like that's a good pattern. That's a good way to do things and all those kind of things. So it just seemed like what we did, like that just made sense to like tick away at things and then get through the other side. But for those that aren't familiar, it's just the idea of having solutions that are built on microservices, they're API centric, cloud/SaaS native, and headless. And so I'm going to touch a little bit on sort of what each one of those things is. And I know Jungho, I'm like advancing here, but it's not catching up here. There we go. So really just, you know, microservices, for those that aren't familiar, is just the idea of like really decomposing capability in your platform so that they're just very, very fine-grained and they're not tightly coupled to each other. So I don't know, I'm trying to think of a good example, but they say something like, if you had an API that was create a user, that's not very microservices. Create a user can have a whole bunch of things, right? You know, you sign up for something, you send an email, you send a text message. So you should have like APIs that are like very, very fine-grained so that you can do each one of those things. And what it also means, being API first, and Jungho teaches courses on some of this kind of stuff. So you know, I'm sure we'll get into more detail, but it's just sort of the ability then to, because you have those like really well-defined interfaces, you can start developing things independently as well of each other. So if you had a better email service that you use when you created a user, it's not monolithic anymore. You can like literally just update the email capability. The rest of the application stays exactly the same. So even if they're behind and changing another service somewhere else, you can keep advancing, and the whole thing doesn't kind of grind to a halt in a monolithic kind of mungy kind of environment. So you know, a key difference, and of course being cloud native and kind of SaaS based, like total kind of game changer, and just like little things anecdotally that, you know, I remember in sort of with my team, we built this whole new report that took over from some legacy massive Teradata mainframe kind of thing, and it was too slow. It was like way too slow. And like literally in a day, I was able to get more compute and everything else, like, you know, built up. And they're like, wow, this is like blazing. And I'm like, yeah, it's only costing you X. They're like, that's just phenomenal. Like they're just used to like cycles where you release something, oh, like the performance is crap, here's another 6 months. So there's just like the pace that you can operate at and bring things up and bring things down was also, you gotta be careful, you gotta watch your dollar dashboards, because you know, one of the things that we did was in our transformation specifically to, and I'll leave out the name of the provider, it wasn't Jungho's, but they kind of gave us like the fastest version of like a database that you can get from them. And so we all got used to running these queries at blazing speed. And then eventually they started doing the chargeback accounting internally. I realized how much my ad hoc, oh, I wonder what our sales were yesterday, was really costing us to get it in 2 seconds. So, you know, definitely once you get used to these things, they're just incredibly easy to ask for, incredibly easy to use, and, you know, throw away as well, but just, you know, something obviously to keep in mind. I think, and the last piece really is when you're building all these kind of things based on using like microservices and all these kind of capabilities, is the idea too of separating kind of like presentation layer orchestration from the backend services. And it's just, again, it was just sort of something that at the time when I was doing it in previous lives, just sort of seemed obvious. We had these things where we have these like vertically oriented thing where the presentation is very tightly coupled to the application, very tightly coupled to the data. And if you change any of those things, it was a testing problem and all these other things. And then as soon as we started getting more into this like headless and all these other kind of capabilities, we could like literally change UIs in like days and like run experiments and do all of these things at a pace and a speed that just was not possible based on sort of the more kind of like traditional three-tiered like monoliths that some of us that have been around maybe a little bit longer kind of might remember. So just wanted to like highlight sort of a couple of those kind of key things. And just like to give you an example, and this is an improved version of a chicken scratching I did for an internal diagram. For those of you, anybody here involved in like e-commerce specifically? Okay. I did this as like, and it's not a Rorschach test, it's not like that's a butterfly, but one of the things that this really was is it's an example of, on the left is orders per minute, and I saw this pattern happen on Black Friday, and on the bottom is time, but time is in seconds on Black Friday. So I was involved in a project, I just took it over, and then first Black Friday, a week later, we had this pattern. And that's basically constrained orders per minute. You're getting a plateau. And I'm sure many of you, if you've ever gotten into diagnosing things with your engineers, you might see it around memory, you could see it, whatever. But it's constrained. And there was all these other problems in terms of like some of the things that I mentioned earlier, you know, release processes that are quarterly, so really kind of slow, the platform kind of like ability to like deal with failures, and just very like closed, especially if they were like monolithic. You couldn't extend them. You couldn't say, I want to use this piece from this company because it's awesome and I want to mix it with this other company who does this really well. It was just really, really hard to do. So then after we went through this transition, this is more what the growth looked like. And I gotta say, it was pretty nerve-wracking sitting in the control room, like, oh, please don't have the same pattern as last year. But it literally, to just watch the things go up, there's no plateaus. And I think one of the key things is not only was the peak way higher, but it lasted much longer. Because in the flat version, you're pissing off customers. You're giving them 500 errors. Like we had nice broken eggs and stuff that we put on our site when we got 500 errors. I have to be funny about it, but when you think about like the business value, again, it's just like how do you tease that stuff out to explain and partner with your engineering teams and your infrastructure teams of why these things are important. The difference between those things is pure revenue. So year on year, when we flattened it before, we were causing a customer problem. It wasn't great to have like a big company, you know, like not being able to serve customers, but it translated into a massive, I think year on year was probably like about 30 or 40% increase in revenue on Black Friday. And it was purely, it wasn't like we introduced brand new features or a product that we had the same like ninja bullet as everybody else. But the big difference was that we were able to serve our customers and deal with the peak. And I think that was kind of really eye-opening for me. A lot of work. And if anyone wants to ask questions later about how do you think about some of these things when you have to go through in only 12 months to get from where we were before to this, like happy to talk through some of those things. But then, you know, through doing things like, you know, microservices, we went through, as I mentioned previously, the idea of like releasing quarterly. We left it a little bit up to the teams because some of them were like, I want to do it daily. We're like, well, go do it daily. And others were like a little bit nervous about it. But we really did have some teams that were releasing things every 2 days and fully automated pipelines and all kinds of like great stuff. So huge, huge difference. Much more reliability. Like obviously we didn't throw eggs on the website. So that was a big change. And then from an open platform perspective, we really started to be able to get into like very cool things. Like we had like, you know, certain search engines, but then we could layer on like AI to do like, you know, query understanding and like all this kind of like cool stuff and at a pace that was just like, we would not have been able to do it before. So some really, really kind of big changes in terms of specifically going through this kind of a technology transformation and coming out the other side with really demonstrable, massive benefit for the organization. So before I hand it over to Jungho, I'm sure he'll have some other things too to add. I got just a couple of quick things just in terms of like resources for like anybody who's, you know, wanting to like dive into these things more. Some of you might already have gone through these things, especially the SaaS folks. But for me, like as well as like having sort of gone through a whole bunch of stuff, like actually doing it and working on these things. If you're new to it, you're trying to figure it out, highly recommend. I actually took every certification from every different provider last fall when I was between work opportunities. And it's just fascinating to understand things a little bit more detailed level, but also to understand from everybody, like, what do they call stuff, and like what's maybe the nuances about what was different. I found there's a lot of similarities, but highly recommend it. Generally, the courseware is all free. If you want to get a certification to put up on your LinkedIn profile, you might pay for something like that, but it's fairly nominal. But they're good in that they cover about some of the business ideas, like why you do it, why is it important, which I think is also good, as I said, like internally to be able to explain to others, like, this is important, we need to invest in this transformation. So highly recommend those. Also, in terms of all the things that I mentioned about the mock kind of principles, the mock alliance is a really, really good resource for information and for white papers about these things. They're starting to roll out like training programs. Similarly, completely vendor agnostic. It's not about any particular solution. It's just talking about some of these kind of patterns. So hopefully that's helpful for some of you. And with that, I will pass it over to Jungho.
Thank you. I'll take that. Thank you, Mark. Okay, so I was introduced as the principal cloud solution architect in Microsoft. I'm actually the principal for the digital and app innovation solution areas. We have multiple solution areas at Microsoft: data and AI, Azure Core, which is the core infrastructure. That's all the IaaS, the network, the storage, which is foundational. Data and AI has a lot of attention right now with things like OpenAI, etc. Digital app innovation is the solution area that focuses on cloud native. So all the microservice type of applications and so on, okay? Let's see, prior to that, I was actually an executive. I was SVP for Cineplex. And then before that, I was a CTO and managing partner of a digital app innovation type of studio called Architect. So we were early adopters of combining design and engineering to bring product to market. Yeah, I was always a deep believer that user interface and user experience design was an architectural concern. And if you did not think about that early, then you're probably going to build pretty crappy products. So always appreciated design and in architectural decisions. Okay, so I generated this with GPT 4.0. Who's been checking out GPT 4.0? Pretty cool, eh? It's actually kind of freaky, but it's pretty cool. So I just asked it, just pretty generate an image that describes product development. So wow, and actually this is the second version. The first one was even more ominous. I asked it to tone it down a bit. Okay, but it's true, innovation's hard, right? There's a lot of unknowns, yeah? The real world is complex and unpredictable. Mark mentioned it. You're going to be doing a big launch. Well, how many cores do I need? How much storage do I need? I have no idea. Just throw a dart, you have no idea, right? God forbid that you don't have enough, yeah? It's complicated. And of course, budget is limited. You're going to have to, a lot of it is CapEx and so on. It's a big investment. So there's a lot of unknowns, a lot of uncertainty. Not only that, the world is changing all the time. I mean, the ground is moving underneath you, right? So how do you have that vision and move forward as product developers? Well, you've all seen this. I'm sure you've all seen this. You want to hit the mark right in the intersection. Sure, you have a great idea, people love it, but if it's not viable, if it costs too much, forget it. If it's not feasible, forget it. You can have the best idea in the world not coming to market. So to get to that sweet spot is really, really hard. Yeah? And you need to rapidly ideate, fail early, right? To try things quickly. I read this fantastic article within Microsoft Organizations that build the muscle to experiment and are able to experiment frequently, direct correlation to innovation. Okay? And if you can't, and if you want to do an experiment, it's going to take you 6 months to deploy something so you can test it, get some actual valid data that you could test your hypothesis with. It takes that long. I'm sorry, I don't have enough patience to wait 6 months. You need momentum to innovate, right? You just can't. You got to move fast. So to ideate, validate, you got to move quickly. You just can't move slow. So need automation end to end. And I'm sure everybody here knows about DevOps, DevSecOps, and so on. We're going to talk a little bit about that. You need standard, portable, composable, loosely coupled API-based services. Now that sounds really technical, but I'm going to dive into that a little bit more and the benefits of that. And you need elasticity and scale when you need it, right? Because compute's expensive. If you don't cost optimize what you're using, your cloud costs can go through the roof. In fact, in many organizations who are not very mature in cloud, it's actually costing more to go to cloud than what they're doing on premise. So they're not benefiting from all the agility and innovation that they can leverage from cloud because they're not thinking about the elasticity of that you can benefit from, right? Data. You can't validate your hypotheses without data, right? If you're going to have a test, and I'm not talking about unit tests, I'm talking about that, you're taking that customer through the funnel, are they putting things into the basket? Are they going to, you want those hard business data, and you need to be able to analyze it, and you need to be able to verify it quickly, right? And security from day one. Unfortunately, the world is less secure, okay? That's just a reality, right, wrong, or indifferent. That's just the way it is, and you got to think about it from day one. All right. So you get all that, but changes, I deal with a lot of big orgs at Microsoft, most of all the big financial institutions, the telcos, and so on. And change in a lot of these organizations is really, really hard. I'm not going to talk about the organizational side of it. I'm only going to talk about it from an architectural side of it because that's an entirely separate talk, okay? But from an architectural side of it, if somebody asks me why is change so difficult, I have to say coupling. And Mark mentioned it, right? Coupling is what makes change so hard. So here's a component. Here's a dependency map of a component. Look at all those lines. Those lines are dependencies. So you change one, you're going to have to impact 10 other things, all right? That is coupling. Now, coupling is not, is necessary sometimes. You build a component A, it's well designed, it does one thing, it does it very well, has a nice clean contract, right? That's probably not going to do much, right? Just that one thing, right? But you have a component B, it does what it does really well, has a nice clean API contract. Alone, it's not going to do much, right? You need multiple components and they need to be able to interact with each other. So that's good coupling. That's natural coupling. But there's other types of coupling that's really bad and unnecessary. So for example, runtime coupling. I remember a project, and this was at a telco. Mark knows the telco. They had shared infrastructure because they wanted to reduce costs. So they were packing a lot of applications onto a VM, right? And they had like 10 applications onto this VM. And they had to update the Java runtime. One application updated, they updated on the entire VM, right? One application, hunky-dory fine, 9 of them went down, all right? Because they were not compatible with that Java runtime. That's coupling, right? And that's unnecessary coupling. So you want to break that. Other coupling is organizational coupling. This is, I'm sure you're all familiar with. I need to make a change. I need to validate it, but I have to call somebody on the database team who's on a separate team, and they have other things to worry about. So it's going to be 3 weeks before I can release my feature. That is organizational coupling. There's many, many different types of coupling. You want to reduce coupling, okay? You reduce coupling, you can move fast. So, microservices. Mark talked about it a bit. Microservices help reduce coupling. Why? Well, you see those little services there in the pretty colors, red, yellow, green, blue? That is a service that exposes its capabilities through standard APIs. So things like REST, GPRC, we're not using some proprietary protocol that only some other component knows. These are standard APIs. And these services does what it does really well. And they only care about what they do. They don't care about the rest of the world. They just care about what they do. So they test it well. They expose not just a functional contract. They say, I am going to commit to you that I'm going to meet 99.99 service level and so on. Like they think about these things, okay? So other services can depend on it and go, okay, I trust you. And if you fail, and by the way, if you're going to depend on a service, you have to expect it to fail, all right? But but we're going off topic here. Now that service, that is going to be deployed because it's decoupled in I'll talk about containers, all right, which decouples runtime and is separately deployable. You can make change to the red service without impacting yellow service, green service, blue service, all right? So you can make small changes. You can make it as frequently as you want. The other services, if they don't want to go at the same cadence, completely fine. The point is there isn't coupling across the services, so you can move fast. So each service or features is owned by an independent cross-functional team. Now that reduces organizational coupling, right? You don't have to call your contact on another team and coordinate schedules and so on, and hopefully everyone is okay with the big bang deployment, which usually is very painful and you have to spend, like late nights and it's just a mess, right? They deploy on their own schedule. So this is not only less stressful, it's less risk and allows you to move fast. Not only that, it is automatable, which is so important. If a system is large and has a whole bunch of dependencies, right? It's difficult to automate, all right? It's difficult to bring up and bring down. It's difficult to move from state A to state B. State A being a well-known state, verifiable state. If you can't move from one verifiable state, testable verifiable state, to another verifiable state, you're in unknown area, okay? Agreed, right? And an unknown area is a very uncomfortable place to be, especially when you want to achieve 99.99 uptime. Like Azure, if we go down, we impact businesses all over the world, okay? We cannot go down. I'll tell you a secret. We go down all the time. But you're not impacted by it, okay? Because we come up really quickly. We're very resilient. It's a different resilience and reliability are two different, subtle but different. We can fail, but we can come up really, really quickly, okay? And a lot of this is because we design systems to be independently deployable, loosely coupled, right? We can deploy small changes without bringing everybody else in for the ride, okay? Okay, so coupling is bad, and microservices help with coupling. Okay, so what is cloud native? So I thought I should define this a bit. There's many terminology here, but from our perspective, cloud native is pretty specific. So when we think cloud native, we're talking about containers, like Docker containers. There's different types of containers out there. Containers is a technology that allows you to isolate your runtime, okay? So you can use a Linux container with Java in one, Node in another, .NET on another, and you can have all these different services that have a different runtime, and they're fully isolated from each other. And what I mean by this is, if I make a change to one container, it doesn't impact other containers, all right? So you can make all the changes you want, all right? These containers, when they come up, at runtime, right? So runtime is when it's actually running, okay? As a process, they only interact with each other through well-known interfaces, something like REST, something like GPRC, some sort of messaging framework, and so on, okay? So containers is a big part of cloud native. Serverless. So serverless, we have an Azure service called Azure Functions. You literally deploy an app, a function app. It can be .NET, it can be Java, it can be Node, it can be Python, it can be based on containers also. You don't have to care about infrastructure at all. Based on some sort of trigger, it'll execute and disappear. And that's great, because while it's not running, it's not costing you anything, all right? So there is a server, technically, if you want to get detailed, but it is abstracted away from you. You do not have to provision this server. You do not need to secure the server. You do not need to configure the server. You do not need to patch the server. You just write your app, your function, deploy it, and that's it, okay? Another is APIs. APIs is critical because you have to publish your capabilities to the world or some consumer. If you don't, then all the great work you did, it's not really valuable, right? It needs to be consumable, and it needs to be consumable in a way that it's coherent. And what I mean by that is I look at an API doc and I go, I give you this input, you're going to give me this output, you're going to do it within a certain time frame, right? You give me expectations that I can design my application around, okay? All right? So APIs are really important. It's not just a point that you expose, there's metadata around it. And it says, this is how you interact with me, all right? Without that, I don't know how to how can I know how to consume this API if I don't know how to interact with it? So APIs are really important. Data. We live in a data world today. We really do. Data is gold. How you access that data, secure that data, gain insights from the data, it's so critical to product development. How are you going to validate your hypotheses without data? It's just a gut feeling, right? How do you know if it's truly desirable? How do you know if it's truly, like customers are wow? You got to have data. All right. So why is cloud native important? We have to move fast. Yes? So it accelerates the feedback loop. Deploy, test, learn, get that feedback, make changes, create an experiment, deploy, test, that's that feedback loop. It'll scale to meet any demand, all right? An evolutionary architecture. This is a really, really important concept. If you're building a product, you don't know how successful it's going to be. You don't know if it's even going to be very successful at all. You hope that it is, right? You don't want budget's constrained, so you're not going to throw millions of dollars at it. You want to make small bets, not big bets, okay? So you want to make small bets. So you're not going to define a full end state architecture right away. There's too many unknowns, right? So you take small bets. Just test this. What do you do? What can you use to test an hypothesis as quickly as possible? Just use a function app. It's serverless. You don't need to provision anything. All you want to do is publish an API, quickly test it. Oh, it's getting more, popular. Maybe you need to capture more data. So you could change your architecture depending on the hypotheses you want to test, right? That's really important. That's an evolutionary architecture. If some architect comes up to you and draws a nice, pretty diagram with all these boxes and lines and so on, says this is your architecture, question it, challenge it, all right? Because it's expensive to commit to decisions, big decisions, too early. Who's heard of lean concepts, right? A fundamental principle in lean is to delay making big decisions as late as possible. Why? So you can get more data. You can learn more, right? Well, how are you going to learn? You got to do experiments. How can you do experiments as cheaply, as cost effectively, and as fast as you can? Well, using cloud-based services, cloud-native services, okay? All right. So being cloud-native on Azure. So we have many services which are related to cloud-native. Because another big factor in building product is optionality, okay? So you want different options to do things. So sometimes people go, Jungho, why do you have so many ways to deploy containers on Azure? It's confusing, right? Not all applications are the same. That's just a reality. You have different non-functional requirements. You have different scaling requirements. You have developers with different skill sets. You have different security requirements, okay? So we build very purpose-built services, right? Instead of a gigantic service that does everything, except cook your dinner, right? Which is complicated, bloated, right? You want lean, purpose-built services, all right? That you choose, based on your non-functional requirements, that what is important to you. But because they're based on composable APIs, you could switch out A for B. That's the evolutionary architecture concept, okay? But on Azure, we have probably the two most popular services today. I'm sure everybody has heard of Kubernetes. Yes, it's a container-based orchestration platform. It was originally called Borg. Yes, it was called Borg. It was at Google. Brendan Burns, who was one of the original founders, is now at Microsoft and leads leads the Kubernetes teams and a lot of our cloud native teams. But Kubernetes was used to orchestrate all the massive, complicated workloads and all these different processes that the scheduling, that the APIs, built web apps, and so on, thousands of apps. And you can imagine at Google how complicated it is, all right? And automated. And that was done with Kubernetes, previously called Borg. Azure Container Apps, which is actually one of my favorite services, I talk about it all the time, and I'm going to talk about it a little bit deeper today, is built on Kubernetes, but it's a little bit simpler. I'll talk a little bit more about it in a second. You got to, once you deploy your applications to either Kubernetes or Azure Container Apps, these are your containers, okay? These are container platforms, right? So these are going to be your APIs. These are going to be your user interfaces. Maybe it's some sort of job that gets triggered on some sort of event, right? And it needs to pull something, process it, and put the output of the processing into a database, but it's event triggered, okay? These are all put on some sort of compute. And in this case, it's Kubernetes or Azure Container Apps. Now, there's serverless services. I talked about functions. They're awesome. We have also something called logic apps, which are more for workflow. Again, you don't need to provision any kind of server, storage, compute, none of that. You just deploy your function or you deploy your logic app. And then we have a whole plethora of database services. Microsoft has adopted open source in a major way. I know some of you might be a little bit behind the times and not believe this, but it's absolutely true. In fact, Kubernetes is completely open source. Azure Container Apps is completely open source. The biggest IaaS OS that we deploy today is Linux. It's not Windows, right? We have come up with our own Linux distribution now, which is hyper-tailored for cloud workloads, all right? But we have a ton of database. Azure Cosmos DB, which is a NoSQL database. It's to deal with non-structured data, not relational data, but it's multi-API based. And what I mean by this, it supports a SQL type of interface. Most people are familiar with SQL, but it also supports a Kafka interface, not a Kafka interface, sorry, a MongoDB interface, and so on. So there's different type of data technologies and interfaces that it supports. okay, to support different developers. So you don't have to, learn SQL to move over to Cosmos DB. You don't have, if you're a Mongo developer, right? You don't have to, you can come to Azure with the skill sets you're already in. A big part of data, obviously, is AI. I'll talk briefly about it because cloud native is, and AI today is very, very closely coupled. Am I getting close?
Yes, 45.
All right. So
It's at 6:45.
6:45. Okay. So I'm going to spend a little bit less time on Azure Container Apps, but Azure Container Apps is a platform for deploying your container apps, and it's fully open source. It's actually built on top of Kubernetes. But Kubernetes is complicated. You have to worry about all these different types of Kubernetes resources and custom resource definitions, a whole bunch of stuff that, frankly, most people don't need to worry about, okay? And then you have to secure it, you have to patch it, it gets really complicated, okay? Container apps, you just worry about your containers. That's it, okay? It is also leverages something called KEDA. KEDA is Kubernetes event-driven auto-scaling. So based on events, your container comes up. No more events, it comes down. Guess what? You don't get paid when none of your containers, you don't have to pay when it's scaled to 0. All right, so it's serverless. Dapper stands for Distributed Application Runtime. Technology people love acronyms. I hate acronyms, they love acronyms, okay? Dapper means Distributed Application Runtime. Basically, all you do is you write your app in your container, Node, Python, so on, but your app, your container process needs to do something. It needs to communicate with something, right? Maybe it needs to send a message to something. So it has what are called these building blocks. And these building blocks are underneath have components that provide these building blocks its actual capability. So a good example is you want to send a message to another component, another service say, right? Well, there's many ways you can do that. You can use RabbitMQ, you can use Kafka, there's many, many ways, all right? Well, you use a building block and all you do is send a JSON message, and whether it's Kafka or whether it's RabbitMQ, it will send a message. The app developer doesn't care. The app developer should not care, all right? So it abstracts away all that infrastructure from you. It's really awesome. Envoy is just an HTTP proxy. It's actually the least interesting thing about Azure Container Apps. But the idea is you focus on apps, not the infrastructure, okay? You almost today have to be an Uber developer to build cloud native apps, or at least you had to. You have to know Kubernetes, you have to know this, you have to know that. Oh my God, your head will spin, all right? You have to do Terraform and so on, like your head will spin. Azure Container Apps is built, it's microservice platform built for application developers who want to build great apps. So definitely read up on container apps. Okay, scale, that's the KEDA. I think I have to get moving because I'm talking too much. I'm gonna move over this too. Microservices plus DevSecOps, automation is critical. Why is microservices important? Why is it helpful? Because it's automatable. And that's a really important thing. Monoliths, which are big, okay, large, difficult to automate. Microservices, small components, independently deployable, right? Easy to automate, okay? So automatable architectures are cloud native. Okay, quick transformation story. Adobe, everyone knows Adobe. You know, they have this, you know about the PDF, they have a document signing service and so on. They were more of a desktop application developer before, but then they started to get into subscription services, SaaS, and so on. They deployed all their services on-prem, and they just weren't able to scale. And they had this whole bunch of different monolithic apps, and they weren't able to change that quickly. They re-architected their entire platform and moved it to Azure onto Kubernetes. Before, they were doing, they were pretty frequent. They were doing multiple releases a month and so on, right? their number of releases and changes they're doing to production today has gone up orders of magnitude. They're doing something like 800 releases a day. And a full third of that is into production. So their pipeline runs are insane. They're doing just tiny little changes and deploying it. All right. Now, not all to production, but out of the 800, a full third of it is to production. That is speed. Okay. So automatable, small changes is really important. So microservices will enable you to do that. Okay. Now I have to talk about AI when it comes to cloud native and product development. I saw a lot of hands go up with GPT and so on. Think about this. ChatGPT was released in November 2022. That's less than 2 years ago. It's completely changed the way we think about apps now. All right. GPT-4, the original version, was deployed in March 2023. GPT-4o, which was the third major release, just got deployed like last month. No, not even last month, like last week. Okay. And in that time, the efficiency, the speed, okay, in 3 releases, less than a year, the efficiency increased 16x, okay? And the cost went down 12x. The pace of innovation is absolutely astronomical, all right? So that's what's happening right now. Now, so why I bring this up is Copilot. Because as product developers, guess what? You work with developers, right? And imagine today, what if you could you all know the concept of pair programming, right? Very valuable. But what if you could, the product developer, yourselves, the UX UI designer, right? And a developer could sit on at a workstation, ideate, and actually write code together. Would that be amazing? Well, that's what you can do with Copilot, all right? And I'm just going to quickly go through all the stats and quickly show you this. I can turn down the volume. So I don't know if you were able to get the entire gist out of that short demo, but basically, you can write a story. You could write a user story. You could write your acceptance criteria. Who would have probably been some product owner that did it. So now you have a product owner writing all this specification right next to the developer, the UI developer, right? And then Copilot will go through your existing repository, understand the dependencies of the components, recommend changes to specific components in order to implement this test case, all right? The specification. It's a brand new, just announced at Microsoft Build service with Copilot called Workspace. When I first saw the demo, my mouth just literally, it was just crazy. Is this going to replace developers? Is this going to replace product managers? That's the question I get all the time. Absolutely not. It's going to change the way you work. Absolutely. I remember when I saw it first, I've been in this business a long time. When I first saw Visual Basic, I thought, okay. And I was a C++ developer. I said, that's it. Like no, like drag and drop worlds, like no, we're gone. Like, we've just been made, obsolete. All right. No, it's the exact same thing. The world's becoming more complicated. We need more products that deals with the complexity of the world today. This is just going to change the way you work, the way you look at problems, the way you ideate. Okay, is it going to build a production system? No, but it will help you ideate, validate quickly. Then the developers dive deeper because now you have a concept that works. Remember the desirable part? Now you got to make it more performant, you got to make it more secure, then you dive into the code and you actually edit it and so on. So it's going to change the way you work, right? So definitely check out Workspace. Just announced that build. It's based on our OpenAI partnership. I can't say any more because it's all under NDA, but it's going to be, you should definitely check it out. You can get on the waiting list. Am I on time?
Yeah, so it's 7 o'clock.
Okay,
So
perfect.
yeah, we can do some audience questions.
Yeah, any
Perfect.
audience
So we-
questions?
Yeah. So we've got questions coming in. So big round of applause for Jungho. So I'm gonna fast forward.